Welcome to Flight 9 of iLikeCake, Lycoming powered Cassutt. Sitting here in the run-up area, just completed the run-up. It's Saturday morning, about 10:30. Out here for a couple hours getting the airplane ready to go fly. It's time to go put a little bit of time on it. The goal for today's flight will be climb tests. So the plan is to do 3 climb profiles, one at 120 miles per hour, one at 130 miles per hour, and the last one at 140 miles per hour. These will start at 3,000 feet indicated and conclude at 6,000 feet indicated, which should give enough time for the speed and the climb rate to stabilize. The temperature is already coming up today, so for the field elevation set at 2,500 feet, the density altitude is already at 3,900 feet. So take that into consideration if you decide to try to calculate any performance numbers based off of the data that I get here. One of the things I considered in choosing runway 15 to take off to the south, even though runway 33 and a northbound departure is the calm wind runway at this airport, there are houses and roads and power lines off to the north. So for the first flight of the day, I wanted to give myself the least risk possible and just depart to the south where there's just bare desert. Another consideration is that while the field elevation is 2,500 feet and my climb gate will start at 3,000 feet, that gives me about 500 feet to stabilize. I figure that should be enough. Get off the runway, pitch for the speed, and be able to capture the speed before I enter my base altitude. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a timer function in the video editing software, so you'll just have to go off the timestamps on the video if you're interested in figuring out where the climbs start and end. Takeoff roll here. Everything's good. Getting a hang of the directional control on takeoff and how much to pitch. Break ground at about the 1,000-foot mark and accelerate low over the runway. I actually ended up accelerating here a little bit past 120 miles an hour, so I ate up a bit of my 500-foot margin trying to come back down to the speed. Another test limitation for these climb profiles was that I did not have my camera aimed down at the instrument panel enough. So you'll only be able to get glimpses of the needle here. So we're gone through 3,000 feet, climbing out. All of the engine temperatures and pressures look good. There's an increased risk here because I cannot see over the nose. The camera is mounted about 3 inches higher than my eye line. So from what I could see in the cockpit from my eyes was basically where the gray ends and the white starts. About that level was in line with the horizon. So the cowl was blocking my entire view forward, which is why I started this very shallow turn to the right. While that will add a little bit of error into the climb data, I felt like that was a risk reduction method so I didn't run into somebody. There we can see just about 4,700 feet, well stabilized at 120 miles per hour. Right about here, I start a right-hand turn that's a little bit more aggressive than the shallow right-hand turn I did right after takeoff. This is because a Cessna 150, who had departed about 45 minutes earlier, called a 5-mile final to runway 33, which meant that he was 5 miles south of the airport, and he called in that he was at 5,500 feet, which, as you can see, I'm just passing over 5,500 feet, and I'm about 5 miles south of the airport. So going back to the risk I talked about earlier about not being able to see in front of me, I was concerned that I might not be able to see traffic ahead of me, and I didn't want to run into somebody. Again, this turn adds a little bit of error into the climb data, but you have to weigh that with the risk of potentially hitting somebody. All right, there's 6,000 feet. I'm going to level off, pull the throttle back to keep the RPM from winding up too high, and turn back to the airport. So that first climb, 120 miles an hour, 3,000 feet to 6,000 feet. If you go back and look at the timestamps, it ends up being about 14 foot per minute. So 1,314 feet per minute on average from 3,000 feet to 6,000 feet. All right, back here over the airport, the Cessna 150 has progressed inbound again and is doing patterns on runway 33. So I'm trying to separate myself so I can come back and go down runway 15 again. You can see I almost flew through a flock of birds there. There's a couple on the right, and then here's another one that caught me by surprise just off to the left. Those were very close, and a lesson learned for me absolutely is I was busy looking over my left shoulder to try to find the Cessna 150 that was in the pattern, looking back at the airport environment to make sure I wasn't getting too far away. And when I looked forward, there were a bunch of vultures thermaling. Vulture and a Cassutt coming into contact with each other would not be a great day. Definitely a good reminder to keep my head on a swivel here. All right, coming back, we're lined up with runway 15 again, going a little bit too fast, so I start coming off on the power here. But like I mentioned before, I'm just going to fly low over the runway, get that good baseline of temperature and density altitude. And I'm going to slow down here to 130 miles an hour, pitch up, and capture 130 miles an hour as I feed the power in and get stabilized within the first 500 feet. I'm starting to climb away, about 2,700 feet here, 2,800 feet, 2,900 feet, and right there, 3,000 feet, start of the climb. And I am stabilized at 130 miles per hour indicated. Again, I've only been flying for the day for just under 7 minutes, so I wanted to reduce my risk of something happening by climbing out over bare desert. You can see some houses there off to my left, but underneath me looks the same as it does off to the right. Nothing but scrub brush and sand. So if something were to happen, since it's early on in the flight, early on in the day, had some things apart on the airplane, if I were to lose my engine, I can just go land on the road or land in the desert, and it only affects my day. It doesn't affect anybody else's day. Something else to consider, however, contrasted to that risk reduction method, is the increase in risk of airport operations, because now I'm flying opposing patterns to a much slower aircraft who's conducting flight training at the airport and using an opposing runway to me. However, since I hadn't been flying for very long that day, I felt like the risk reduction of using the other runway outweighed the risk increase of flying an opposing pattern. And as you'll see here for the last climb, I actually came in and flew down runway 33. About 200 feet left to go until we get to 6,000 feet. 50 feet, stabilize 130 miles an hour, and there's 6,000 feet. If you go back and look at the timestamps, this resulted in an average climb rate of 1,269 feet per minute, which surprised me because for a 10 mile an hour increase in climb speed, it only resulted in less than a 50 foot per minute decrease in climb rate. And with the amount of needle swing I have, the unknown amount of static error I still have in the system, and the turns that I'm making, it's possible that 50 feet per minute could just be lost in the experimental error, which really means that the difference between the climb rate at 120 miles an hour and 130 miles per hour is not really that much. Let's see how the airplane climbs at 140 miles per hour. We're set up here coming down short final for runway 33. The only reason I used runway 33 for the third climb profile was because I'd had a little bit more time in the airplane for the day and I was feeling more confident in the aircraft systems. And it fit better with the patterns that the Cessna 150 was flying. What you don't see in this video are all of the S-turns and 360s that I had to make in and around the airport, over the airport, in the pattern, trying to fit my faster, higher performance aircraft in with a much slower aircraft involved in flight training, which means that their patterns were very wide, then they took a long time getting around the pattern. This highlights, again, the situational awareness that somebody flying a faster sport plane needs to have when operating, especially in an uncontrolled airport environment. Anybody who's flown an RV or any high-performance sport airplane knows that it can be challenging to sequence themselves in with flight training traffic or slower aircraft, especially in a busy pattern. And being able to understand where everybody else is and how you fit into the puzzle and what you need to do as the pilot in command of a higher performance aircraft, be able to responsibly fit in with the other operations is very important. Another risk area that it highlighted for me in terms of flight test is that it ended up putting me in positions where I was low energy, meaning I was low speed, maneuvering, trying to stay behind the slower aircraft. I was at pattern altitude, so I wasn't very high. And if I were to have had an emergency, it would have not put me in a very good place to be able to return to the airport, get out of the airplane, or do any of the things that I might have to do on an experimental test flight. So thinking back over that, that's another lesson learned and a potential risk to flight test being operations at an uncontrolled airport with very dissimilar traffic. We're stabilized here 140 miles per hour, climbing out to the north. You see the beautiful splash of green in the brown desert. 140 miles per hour, just climbing through 5,400 feet. An interesting data point for this third climb test at the highest speed was that the cooling was the worst out of all three climbs. So the 120 mile per hour climb resulted in the best cooling, 130 mile per hour climb was second best, and the 140 mile per hour climb was the worst. This has to do with the the lowering of the pressure over the top of the cowling, the top of the fuselage, at the higher angle of attack required to fly at the 120 mile per hour point. And with the updraft cooling, a lower pressure on top of the cowling means that the cooling air is able to come out more easily, which gives greater engine cooling. With the climb test complete, it was time to move on to the second portion of the flight, which was opening up the engine envelope from a maximum of 2,500 RPM that I've been limiting myself to, all the way up to the red line RPM of the engine, which is 2,900 RPM. You can see here I'm level at about 5,900 to 6,000 feet, heading east. Start to push the throttle in here. You see on the transducer tack there, it's going past 2,700 RPM. It's 2,800 RPM. And just about to brush up to 2,900 RPM. If you note the airspeed indicator, the airspeed indicator took a while to respond to the increase in power because the aircraft had to accelerate itself. Maintaining altitude, the airspeed is pretty much stabilized at this point. You can see that wide open throttle at 2,900 RPM, we have about 193 miles per hour indicated. There's definitely room for improvement on the top end of things for aerodynamically, but for now, having only about 8 hours in the airplane, pretty happy with that speed. Big old wing over to the left here to point back to the north and lose some energy and pulled power back to 2,400 RPM. If you're going to do a wide open throttle test at altitude, you might as well do a wide open throttle test low. Here's a botched go around, tongue in cheek. But in all seriousness, because the airport measures temperature, I had a fixed data point for density altitude, which means that I had a fixed point for my true airspeed. So in order to get real data for what my true airspeed was, I needed to know what the temperature was with my indicated airspeed. So here I'm at wide open throttle, going down the runway, and if I read my indicated airspeed, I can correlate that to the temperature to find my true airspeed. Pulling off to the west, bleeding off energy, and then I came around to set up left traffic for runway 15. Back in the place where we almost had the run-in with the birds a few minutes ago, left base, runway 15, and this time pulling the power back to land. I ended up being about 5 miles an hour too fast on this landing, and I somehow touched down tailwheel first, which you'll see the main gear hit there, and then I bounced, and then I bounced, and then I bounced again. Took a pretty good swerve to the left there, got under control, and right there the tailwheel comes back down. Now that we're down and back, let's debrief the flight. So we successfully accomplished 3 climb profiles. The first one at 120 miles per hour, the second one at 130 miles per hour, and the third one at 140 miles per hour. The first climb resulted in a climb rate of 1,314 feet per minute, the second was 1,269 feet per minute, and the third was 1,269 feet per minute also. This means that for a difference in climb speed of 20 miles per hour, there was only a 50 foot per minute difference in the 3 different climb rates. This was surprising to me, as I would have assumed with such a great increase in airspeed, there would have been a much bigger difference in climb rate. Of course, there is still an unknown amount of static error. With the needle swing, there's definitely error in this data, so take that as you would. I'm interested now to go do some climb tests at 110 miles per hour and at 150 miles per hour to see if on either side of these 3 speeds, there's a significant difference in climb rate. However, thinking about the climb rate at a faster speed with the low aspect ratio of the wing and the reduction in induced drag, this data may actually make sense. More flights to come on that in the future. The envelope expansion of engine RPM was also successful. This was the first time I've pushed the throttle all the way forward at altitude. So for this test point, we were at 6,000 feet indicated altitude. And with wide open throttle, the resulting RPM was 2,900 RPM, which is right at the engine's red line, which means the prop is well matched to the aircraft, and this resulted in a speed of 193 miles per hour.